Greetings, everyone, and welcome to a very engaging conversation among sister queens. I'm really honored today that we're going to have an opportunity on VICCNotes to do a very informative yet research-driven interview with the illustrious, honorable African Queen Mother Warrior, Sister Dr. SandRa Richards. Greetings, how are you doing?
Greetings, Sister Dr. Chen.
How are you? Sister Dr. Chen, how are you? We're keeping things together so that as we prepare to make this part of our live on Facebook and it brings truth to power, it gives us an opportunity to really bring some things to light. And it will give us an opportunity to share with our audience a little bit more about some of the great work that you've been doing as part of the Global African Research TROD that was geared towards your work in 2019 and how you've been able to expand that work further on. So we're very excited about what is to come. So we're going to, take a moment so that we can at least get things set up and arranged to be able to do our live work on Facebook. And in the event there are any issues, critiques, then we're going to just move it forward and keep doing some other things as we progress with this morning. I'm also very excited because it gives us an opportunity to show some of the long-standing work efforts that you've been an integral part of. And so what I am going to comfortably ask of you is, just for you to give us an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit more about, who you are, what you're doing, why you do it, and things of that nature. Because sometimes, definitely on Sundays, it's really joyful when our sisters can gather and actually share in our conversations. So just before we open up, I'd just like for persons that are listening, you're tuning into an interview with Sister Dr. SandRa Richards, who is a senior program officer at the University of the West Indies. And most importantly, we're going to have her share part of her work, her research around her Global African TROD. I will hopefully be able to have a couple of things shared in this regard, and we're going to move these things forward in our own direction. And hopefully, because we're having some other issues, we're going to just move this ahead and keep with the recording. So I will share the very concise yet detailed bio of Sister Dr. SandRa Richards. Sister Dr. SandRa Richards is an African-centered scholar, practitioner, and holds a master's degree in education and a PhD from Brunel University for her research in the area of education inclusion. Her work is rooted in the principles of Ma'at and interested in equity. Her book, The Way We See It, teases out uncomfortable historical links between school exclusion and British educational policy. In it, she calls for quote unquote difficult conversations, which requires moving beyond the discomfort of white supremacy to address the gap between the theory and practice of social inclusion. In addition, Sister Doctor is also the author of The Journey, a self-development workbook which offers practical solutions for healing and growing. It encompasses strategies for educational achievement, parenting, and rites of passage through life's ages and stages. Sister Dr. SandRa is respectfully addressed as Sister Doctor as she seeks to hold on to an African sensibility and connection with a global African village and accept her status as researcher. Much of her recent work in service to the community has been linked to empowerment conferences in the UK, the Caribbean, the United States, where participants are actively engaged in the business of self-knowing and self-healing. She has been the featured speaker for more than a decade at the annual UK Day of the Goddess event for workshops, speakers, talks, dance, and entertainment, where women meet together to work together, laugh together, cry together, and heal together. Sister Dr. Sandra Richards left the UK in 2008 to join the University of the West Indies. Prior to this, Sister Dr. Sandra lectured in social policy and was a community activist promoting inclusive education, especially for marginalized African diaspora communities with heritage rooted in the Caribbean. Sister Dr. Sandra is particularly passionate about education and social justice demonstrated through her student-centeredness, outreach, and activism. She bravely seeks to rupture Eurocentric and Asiatic norms by daring to position personhood as a new normal informed by African ancestral sensibilities fused with Eastern and Western assigned methodologies. In so doing, Sister Dr. Sandra makes visible the trauma inflicted by conflicted ways of being, drawing on a combination of coaching, culturally sensitive counseling, stillness, and movement. Her approach introduces unconventional methodologies to recalibrate our spiritual center and undertake a purposeful life journey. And with that, I'd like to welcome to our VICCNotes interview and broadcast the illustrious Sister Dr. Sandra Richards. Thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Sister Dr. Chen. I have to say that it is a thrill, a pleasure, an honor to honor this conversation with you. I know of your works too, and I think as academics in an education system that doesn't always understand us and ensure that the cultural nuances are appropriate, it's, I think, very apt that I'm speaking to the director of a center that focuses on cultural aspects of our being. So it is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity.
Yes, so part of what we'd like to be able to share, and the reason why this was so important to each of us to have an opportunity to provide this resource, because what you bring to the table is a very unique resource. We tend not to have our academics engaged in a global African research tribe. That's usually, you know, it may be a particular portion of African-centered activity, or it might be something around the vestiges of enslavement, or sometimes it may be about, you know, our ancestral legacy. However, when we say a global African research tribe, and based on the background that you're bringing from your own publications, research, and work, because, you know, it provides another layer, another latitude, let's say, of how we begin to look at academics, those that focus on, you know, teaching versus research or quality assurance and development, etc. You know, and in your capacity as a senior program officer, you know, with regional responsibilities with WUVI, it brings another layer of how, you know, grateful we are that the institution even saw that type of insight to give you that latitude and that opportunity to, you know, be on sabbatical and to do this work, and then come forth with another layer of analysis, engagement, assessment, evaluation tools that professors are able to use, researchers are able to use, especially those that desire to do that higher order thinking level of cognitive engagement around education, around sociological frameworks and things of that nature. So let's like get into the thrust of the work. So share with us, you know, what was the rationale? If you choose, you could share, you know, the abstract that you utilized to start this work, you know, that just helped you to develop your hypothesis. And why did you decide to do this global African research tribe?
Well, you know, I have to acknowledge, first of all, that you do your research. Clearly, you know about my work, you know about me, and you know about the institution that I am in service to. The University of the West Indies is activist university. Activist university. Rooted in history of a Caribbean that endured a colonial project, let's call it that, a form of socialization that has left the region, its inhabitants and its descendants worse off because of the European project of exploitation, dehumanization, otherwise known as chattel slavery, so on and so forth. That project also included capturing not just African people physically, but capturing African people spiritually, capturing African people intellectually, disrupting families, disrupting a normal, healthy trajectory. And because of this disruption, there is a consequence which disadvantages people of the region. African people in the diaspora, wherever they live, have been affected by this European project. So the University of the West Indies is the right place for me to be situated in terms of my practice, my research, my contribution to our well-being. And I am grateful to the University of the West Indies for being such an activist university, for having the foresight to provide support during a period where I was relieved to some extent of my substantive duties to be able to pursue research and come back and speak to some of the issues that are of interest to the university, but are also interest to me personally. So the thinking behind the research, building on my original publication, the way we see it, is to look at the education experiences of the diaspora with a view to recovering an approach that allows Africans in the diaspora to go into higher education, to be able to be socially mobile, to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are there for all of us once we have equal access to education. And I want to here distinguish education from schooling, because my earlier research would have made that distinction. Schooling is pretty much about training a population to be streamed into certain roles in society. So you're taught about a certain monarchy, you're taught about a certain privilege, a certain world order. You're given a sense of your own identity. You're told about your history through the lens and perspective of other people, because the agenda is to maintain the status quo. And unfortunately, the status quo places African people at a great disadvantage. So in approaching this research, I sought to access and examine and then analyze the education experience of Africans in the diaspora. And I have a particular interest in Africans who are linked to the Caribbean, because we are the University of the West Indies, but also because my own personal heritage comes through the Caribbean. I was raised in the UK, but I have a very close relationship with the Caribbean and by extension with the continent. And the rationale for the research and my proposal specifically was to advance the university's strategic initiative of increasing access among these particular populations. So when I say that, what I'm saying is that the university has a global presence. It recognizes Caribbean peoples across the world and other peoples, but I have a particular interest in our peoples because of a history that we have had that is often not discussed. It's certainly treated in a very academic way in many instances. And to be true to our full history, there has to be a cultural nuance. There has to be a recognition of the African sensibilities, the trauma that has affected this population, the disadvantage that we're placed at economically, historically, socially, in so many ways. So my research really looked at the education project as distinguished from the schooling project with a view to advancing the university's aim to embrace populations of the Caribbean and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So thank you for just giving us the full parameters of that research, because again, sitting in the seat that I sit at the University of the Virgin Islands, within the Virgin Islands Caribbean Cultural Center, your work becomes very valuable because it helps to bring a context so that when we're doing this global research in general, right, and we're having these opportunities to speak of Caribbean studies, Caribbean cultural studies, Caribbean social science research, Caribbean humanities research, etc., it allows us to have a stronger framework, foundation, and groundation, because the people of the Caribbean are primarily people of ancestral African ancestry with indigenous ties to the continent as well as to other parts of the globe. And so this becomes very rich, rewarding, and supportive, so that it helps to create another layer of the importance and the value and the worth of being able to have these perceptions and these perspectives and these ideological frames of reference, through your work. So, and I get really excited. So I'll continue. I'll continue. So, like, you've pretty much so covered the overall hypothesis and why you decided to do this work, how it's grounded in some of your other publications, of which I really would like, before we close, that you share with the viewing and listening audience ways that we can get copies of these publications, and especially those that are available digitally during this time. And you've also given us clarity on the parameters of the Global African Research TROD that you have been on. And this seems like it was, yes, something that was commenced and engaged in during your leave in 2019, and it took you to different places. So I'd like for you to also speak, is there a particular methodology that you utilized, or is there something that is developing out of this research that's going to establish another methodological frame of how we begin to do research in the areas you've shared?
Okay, thank you for that. So I just want to touch first on the context that you refer to. African peoples exist in a global environment. I think it's important to make that point very clearly, so that when you find Caribbean people in the Caribbean, we're not just affected by what's happening in the Caribbean. When you find Caribbean people who are in Europe, they're not just affected by Europe. They're not just affected by the Americas if they live in the Americas, so on and so forth. Because to be African-centered, you have to recognize that spirit is primary, and that we have ancestors, that we come from a place. We have a lens through which we view the world and through which we experience our liberty our being here. And that really is about the personhood project. You know, it's really about, and I don't even like the term project really, because that sounds like you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is a continuum. This is a continuum. And so the personhood liberty is really recognizing that we can talk about the theory of these things, but we have to talk also about the impact of these things. So as an academic, I can write about the theory, I can cite authorities, I can become myself an authority within the context of the academy. However, my research is real. It's about real people living in a global context. And so it's important to me to point that out. And also the issue of identity, that we recognize that how we move through this world is shaped by what happens to us in this world. And so context and identity are really, really key. In terms of the methodology, my research really is aligned very closely to grounded theory. It's aligned very much to applied research and action research. For me, much of this is, there is no separation. You have a research approach that means that the researcher must immerse themselves within the context of the phenomena that's being researched. So the theories that emerge out of this research come out of work, out of activities that are actually taking place. So the theories are grounded in liberty. They're not theories that are just, you know, thought up and formulated and presented. They are theories out of things that are happening. And in the case of the work that I'm doing, these are practices which are found to be working. They are actually having a positive impact. And so the theory comes out of works that are already happening, but they are just presented in a particular structure. The applied research aspect of it is about doing research that makes a change. So even as I'm doing the research, I am in effect affecting change. I am contributing to change. It is like a, I guess, a change agent kind of activity. So in my research, I'm very clear to take on the identity of a researcher, to observe the criteria, ethical criteria, but also in collecting data, I am wanting to observe the principles of Ma'at and be reciprocal. So I'm also taking advantage of or being invited to make presentations, deliver lectures, facilitate learning episodes. So that is part of the action research approach. So what did I actually do? What I did was to, because I already have an awareness of a community of Africans in the diaspora, I reached out to that community and said, I want to look at this particular phenomena. I work at a university that has a history that is rooted in the same heritage as the particular population. And I want to engage with this population to get a sense of what is happening in education to us. Are we actually getting the opportunity to go into higher education? Are we going to university? Are we getting to go to college? Are we staying in school? What is actually happening on the ground? And a number of organizations and individuals responded, and I am very grateful. In my report, I mention them, I acknowledge them, but they are not necessarily the institutions that are adhering to the parameters given to us by a European sensibility. These organizations of learning, institutions of learning, are conducting their classes and their approaches in something that is referred to in my earlier work, which is education other than at school. EOTAS, education other than at school, commonly known as homeschooling, commonly known as supplementary schooling, commonly known as, there's a number of ways in which the education effort is being delivered by the very community that is being affected disproportionately in a negative way. So basically, we are teaching ourselves about a world history, about physics, about spirituality, about everything, economics. We are working to recover our own educational experience because we have learned that the Eurocentric European educational experience, otherwise known as schooling, doesn't always place us at the advantage, or at least on the same equal footing as our colleagues in this human experience.
That's very true. I want to thank you for crafting another nuance to how these questions in this particular discussion, and we desire to have this conversation so that we could actually speak truth to power and look at how the forms of education in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in Europe, globally, are impacting our people of African ancestry. I just desire to add this little caveat: the fact that this is the 6th year, towards the last quarter actually, of the 6th year of United Nations designated International Decade for People of African Descent, which highlighted and promoted recognition, justice, and development. This type of research, this type of proactive research, this type of grounded grassroots through the intellectual levels of higher education. What you've produced, what you are producing, what you are contributing towards is really helping many of us in various institutions globally, because many times we don't have researchers that will help us to facilitate the difference between just doing the research for the purpose of theoretical engagement versus embracing the theoretical engagement with implementation opportunities, with the continuum that you referenced, with the proactivity that you referenced, and the activism. So I'm very grateful for you explicating that very succinctly. One of the other inquiries that I have, and it's in terms of just following through with some of the research, and then we can go into some other open areas as we move forward in this conversation, is what were the main findings? No, before I get to the findings, I know what I overlooked. So where did you go? What were some of the places? I mean, we know some of the places you went, but share with us some of the places that you went. Where did this Global African Research Triad take you?
Okay. So I have to try and control my excitement when I go here, because it was so stimulating to be able to do this work. And I again give thanks. I give thanks to the university, of course, but I give thanks to the universe. I give thanks to those who have gone before, the scholars who have carved away so that one such as myself can develop a level of confidence to be able to perhaps breach those very tightly constrained Eurocentric approaches to research. You know, if you don't do research in this particular way, then it is not considered to be research of a high standing. What I'm daring to do is to say that through our lens and through our experience, research needs to happen in this particular way. And because other people can't do it, doesn't mean it's not legitimate. So in terms of, I mean, I'll come to where I went, but in terms of how I did it, I did employ strategies of using focus groups, you know, having people come together to discuss the issue of education or schooling and how that's impacted us. What is, what are our ideas of what education is about? And I also did interviews. You know, I spoke to individuals, I spoke to groups. I was able to sit within lecture theatres, if you like, and pose a question and then listen to the response from the question, so that the research approach allowed the kind of village idea, you know, where councils of elders, you know, specialists, educators, researchers, teachers can come together, around a particular topic. Also students can come together. There is some echo that I'm hearing right now. So that I'm interfering with what I, yeah, thank you. So where did I go? Where did the research take me? It was important for me to be able to go to the continent. I went onto the continent of Africa. I then went to the States, to the Americas. I had some conversations in the Caribbean, and I had some conversations in the UK. And all of those conversations facilitated that cultural nuance, because the Global African Research TROD, and the TROD part of it, through one of my research supporters, was opened up further. So it wasn't just a TROD in terms of, you know, I will be walking or I will be doing this international research activity, but it was a travel round our diaspora. That's where the TROD really reflects our experience and this research, which is centered in our personhood, our real lived experience as Africans in diaspora. When I went to these various destinations, I got a very, very useful insight into the reasons why people have chosen these, what I'm calling acts of resistance. Because if we look at the education system as it's rolled out by Europe, a Eurocentric one, as I would have mentioned earlier on, it has placed us in a very interesting relationship with Europe. So we still look to Europe as being the standard bearer because of the education that we've had. Europe obviously knows. And so when we are looking at quality, we look to Europe. When we are looking at education programs, we look to Europe. We look to the West for the benchmarking. We are, in quality assurance, we are addressing it in some ways to make it relevant to our context. So we have regional benchmarks, and we have in the University of the West Indies institutional benchmarks, because we are a regional institution, and we have a presence in some 17 territories within the Caribbean region. However, we still give a lot of priority, if you like, to Europe. And so part of the TROD took me to kindergarten. It took me to homeschooling ideas. And the reason why these homeschooling institutions were formed, it took me to schools for young people who are out of kindergarten, but before they go into higher education. It took me into institutions and organizations that are providing education for those who want a university education, so graduates of the, I'm not saying lower order, but for the younger students. And it also took me into institutions and organizations that provide education experiences for adult learners. So in terms of where I went, geographically, I went to the continent of Africa, I went to America, I went to Europe, and in the Caribbean, because that is where we live. We live in other places as well. We live in Asia, we live in other places, but this is where the research took me. And in terms of the institutions and organizations, it took me on the spectrum of learning, of education, from the very young to the adult learner.
Thank you for sharing that, because there were a number of additional questions that were going to be driven from that. So we'll save those for our next interview, because I could tell that this is going to be very full and very robust, because, you know, when I hear, you know, references to Namibia, and I know Namibia has done major modifications in their educational systems, you know, beyond the British infantry educational structure. And over the last decade, definitely in the last decade, and it has been developmental from their independence, you know, from former colonial vestiges. And it's very important, the impact that the Germanic traditions in education had that were blended with these British educational structures, particular to Namibia. And I only speak of that because of some of the non-governmental organizations that focus on education that we've had the opportunity to work with and do collaborations. And again, this whole conversation coming up on how do we establish a African benchmark in these spaces where it's predominantly people of African ancestry, in contrast to seeing that the Eurocentric or European, and I go further, the American Western paradigms are seen as ongoing engagement, that anything outside of those superior educational theories, curricula, standards, etc. When you speak of being in the UK, I know that that brought a lot of the groundation and the grassroots, all, you know, from young to the not so young, and to, you know, it was an intergenerational trot. I really am thankful. Travel around our diaspora. Yes. I appreciate you sharing what TROD, because, you know, we were just with you walking and moving through the earth. So you gave us even another developmental space to really see how the TROD was connected to your global African research continuum. I will not refer to it as a project or only a temporal piece, because I see it's ongoing. The other part, when you reference, you know, what you were able to do in 48 contiguous US, along with being in the Caribbean, and we know that you do a lot of different engagements here in the Caribbean, I'd like for you to speak to, so based on where you traversed to this book, what were some of the critical findings from this research? And I would go as far as to say, once you share that, please extend to, from those findings in your research, what were some of the conclusions that you would like to share with us? Because I'm sure that there's other outlets that you would like to share your work through. So at least for the purposes of our public engagement this day, I would love for you to share what were your primary findings, and from those findings, what were some conclusions that you've drawn from your research?
Thank you for that. And, you know, I said earlier on that I get stimulated and thrilled by the research thought, the research idea, the research activity, the research data, the research analysis, and the research conversation. Just the whole, I don't like the word projects, I have to find another one, but the whole research idea and activity for me is very stimulating. It is part of an empowerment movement, you know, to have difficult conversations, to recognize that that which was being done hasn't served us well. And so we need to do something to address it, and we are doing something to address it. That in itself is, to me, hugely satisfying and very stimulating. I want to, at this point as well, acknowledge one of the team, if I may refer to them in that way, team members, people who partnered with me to be able to assist me be able to do this. One person in particular is Queen Mother Yeshiba, who has helped to coordinate the dates. And, you know, we had some challenges with flights and meetings and ground transportation. And, you know, to be able to get the TROD, keep it on track, you need to have partners on the ground who, when you're in the air or when you're in transit, they are holding the space, they are following up on meetings, so on and so forth. So I want to acknowledge Queen Mother Yeshiva. I also want to acknowledge Elder Emperor Kwabena Bernia, who is the one who, in a radio interview, as we talked in this way that you and I are talking, it stimulated us so much, it opened us up so much that we realized that the TROD was a travel around our diaspora. And so he birthed the name. So I conceptualized the Global African Research TROD, and he said, well, what you're doing is you're traveling, you know, around our diaspora. And I, you know, I promised that I would continue to, you know, you want to acknowledge those authorities and you want to cite the people who are contributing, because that is contributing, because that is ethical.
Right.
Yes.
And
so,
that's true. That's ethical. It's
yes,
very
so
ancestral. Yes.
Yes. In terms of my findings,
Yes.
in terms of my findings, I'm very feedback again. Sorry. Yeah, there we are. In terms of my findings, what was consistent in every destination was the empowering position of the principal behind the education initiative. Every person who I spoke to about why they were doing what they were doing, what it was they were doing, the impact of what they were doing, referred to needing to intervene. There needed to be an intervention that was to help us recover from the schooling project, from the schooling agenda of a European school of thought. The European school of thought and the schooling activity is in many cases punitive. You get punished if you don't know. It's not necessarily a safe place not to know. So those people who go into school not knowing often feel a fear because it may be found out that they don't know. And you are punished, often publicly, you're humiliated because you don't know. The other constant that I discovered was the idea that the intervention needs to be kind. The intervention needs not to pathologize the student. Oftentimes, Africans who go into a European setting or a Eurocentric setting, if they are not responding to the Eurocentric pedagogy, they are considered to be disaffected, special needs. There's something wrong with the student, and not enough attention is paid to the curriculum, content, the pedagogy, the teacher, the principles and philosophy of the education institution itself. So what is clear to me is that our response, our African-centered model, our education intervention has to be one that has a sensibility around culture, around the learner. So it is not unusual, therefore, to take the learner outside of a clinical setting called a lecture theatre or a school classroom or something that's confining in that way. Take the learner into social contexts because we are social beings and therefore we respond very well to social contexts. Also, the relevance to the learner of what it is they're learning. Because as social beings, as spiritual beings, we are often looking for ourselves in the experience. So many students and many principals, if I may call them that, spoke of education experiences where their primary school teacher or they had a particular mentor or somebody who coached, somebody rescued them from a scenario called school. It's very sad, it's a difficult conversation, but it's the truth. Schooling isn't necessarily a safe place for everybody. And so these entities that are providing education recognize the value of the student. It's not just about the value of the teacher, it's about the value of the student. It's about the relevance of the curriculum. It's about the relevance not just of the here and now, but it's a futuristic, but also an approach that recognizes ancestry, recognizes that we come from a place of greatness. So our reference points are not slavery, are not colonialism, are not Great Britain, are not the standard bearer being Europe. It's about the standard bearer being Africa. So that was part of, for me, a revelation, because you're in an education system and you are concerned, or I am concerned about the student experience, and that the student experience should ignite delight. We want to ensure that our students are eager and they are engaged and that they are achieving. We don't want to have schooling episodes where the students feel harassed, oppressed, intimidated, fearful. And unfortunately, that is some of the feedback that we're getting from students, that their education experience is one that they're engaging in because they want to go for promotion, maybe, or they want to fit in, maybe, or it is mandatory that they go to school. These are the reasons why many people engage in that schooling idea, not because of a natural love of education, not because something within them has been ignited and they want to be there and they want to do homework and they want to continue the learning experience even outside of the school class lesson or even outside of the lecture session or outside of the workshop. What I found in my research is that the students of these particular entities that I went to visit wanted to stay even after the teaching, the prescribed teaching session. That students were taking the initiative and becoming self-directed learners, that the excitement wasn't just residing with the teacher, but it was also residing with the learner. These are some of the things. And I think a really unexpected one for me was the importance of spirit. There was an unashamed, if that's even a word, unashamed acknowledgement of ancestors, of the part of the person that can't be seen, the vision for the future of that student. So not that you would be, there's no point you studying this, there's no point you studying science because you're never going to be a scientist. The possibilities that the educator has for the student is quite remarkable. The educators refer to their students as future world leaders, the future, they speak of people who have been groundbreaking in their own particular discipline, and they refer to their students as the next one of these great people. So that for me was hugely satisfying, and it wasn't limited to the Caribbean. It wasn't limited to the continent. It wasn't limited to the Americas. It was consistent wherever this approach to educating Africans in the diaspora took place. So those are some of the findings. There are some other things that are emerging as I continue to do the analysis of the data, but yeah, those were some key areas right there.
Well, those areas give us some parameters of all of the things that we've asked. And we really were very thankful, very grateful that there was okay. There's been forgive me for losing that particular train of thought. I just know that there's a very serious component for how we can speak of education. And you've been able to provide us with the sociological framework, the anthropological framework, a psychological framework, an economic framework, a cultural framework, and most importantly, you fuse this within an ancestrally sound spiritual framework. And that's the part that's always really important to us, because it takes us a moment to be able to speak of these things and still keep it. Yes, it's in an academic setting that you did this particular work. It's linked to non-academic human and on practice. So that's why I was very thankful that you took the time to share with us the overarching purpose of the work. The
I've lost your audio. Oh, technology is amazing. I can't hear a thing. You can use the chat. I don't know if we have chat, if we can, because I can't hear anything. I guess what I've learned to do, because of my approach, okay, yeah, thank you. Because of my approach, you just continue to adjust yourself to whatever the scenario presents. My conclusions, they are both personal and institutional. And I'll speak to the institutional aspect of it first. Certainly at the University of the West Indies, the approach to assessing and providing criteria or parameters or predictors speaks to a rounded student. We are looking at not just having our graduates leave the institution knowing about the discipline, but as being people or citizens of the world who can function at the same level or higher, preferably higher, than our counterparts right across the globe. We also are interested in widening access, recognizing that our students come from different places and have different experiences. And the Caribbean African experience is not necessarily one that's recognized by other institutions of higher education in the world. The University of the West Indies is unique because it is birthed out of that very experience. Our Vice-Chancellor, our current Vice-Chancellor, is very forward-thinking and very active in terms of the conversation around reparations, repair, ensuring that the institution is able to respond, is flexible, and is relevant, so that the institution is progressing as a world leader in terms of how we respond to issues affecting education. In terms of my own personal conclusions, somewhere I think within my being, and I reserve the right to be a being, not just an academic and not just an administrator. And I think that that has been a challenge in a professional career where you present as melanin rich. Let me say that. Dark-skinned, melanin-rich, natural hair wearing, in a context where academics have a particular, historically, we have a particular persona. And spirituality is not necessarily something that is expressed personally. It is expressed as a discipline to be studied and written about, but as an academic, practitioner, activist, woman, all of those aspects of who I am inform the conclusion that I will now share with you. And that conclusion is that these emerging educational entities demonstrate leadership in a climate that is changing. And right now we are in the midst of a so-called pandemic, and the terrain is changing, and the importance of being able to respond to the needs of the learner is more critical now than ever before. And these entities that I was fortunate enough to be able to visit with, the individuals I was able to speak with, have demonstrated that this new way, this homeschooling, this education other than at school, is as relevant and legitimate as any other Eurocentric model of education or organization. So my conclusions are that we should look more to these initiatives, these emerging models, to ensure that we have a world that meets the needs of its global citizens and not just those who respond well to a Eurocentric model of education and organization. That's kind of controversial, I know. Your sound is completely gone. I guess we are going to be using the group chat now, and I will read out. I will read out the entry into the group chat. You're thanking me, and I'm wanting to also thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about what I consider to be a very, very crucial aspect of our lived experiences. If we are not equipped to be able to enter into learning situations safely and exit knowing more than we did when we went in, then we are doomed. Not just some of us, all of us are doomed. And your center, your institution has really been at the forefront in many instances of sharing the aspects of African and indigenous concerns, breakthroughs, and it's a privilege and a pleasure to be able to share with someone as esteemed as yourself, Dr. Chen. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Hear Your Voice, Caribbean Cultural Center. I know that there is a huge amount of work that's coming out, and you are experts in multimedia, and I'm a novice. I'm a novice at the multimedia platforms, the social media platforms. So I look forward to, keeping an eye on what's happening at the Caribbean Cultural Center at the University of the Virgin Islands, and learning and continuing to learn. So thank you very much. Take care.